not even thinking of Ryan and going straight into like Luke. I think, you know, it's a bit disrespectful from people because of the calibre of player that Ryan is. But yeah, for me, I'm not even looking at playing Luke at the moment. My main objective is obviously playing Ryan. That's my first goal.
Fallon Sherrock made history as the first woman to beat a man at the World Darts Championship, but not everyone was cheering. Behind the scenes, she's faced betrayal, rivalries, and even personal heartbreak. Some players admire her, others can't stand her, and a few have treated her so badly, she admits she feels unwelcome in her own sport. Today, we're breaking down the 7 players Fallon Sherrock just might hate the most, and trust me, the final name will shock you. Lisa Ashton isn't just another name in women's darts. For years, she was the name. Before Fallon Sherrock ever made headlines at Alexandra Palace, Lisa had already built a reputation as the dominant force in the women's game, stacking up world titles and proving herself as a trailblazer. But when Fallon arrived on the scene, everything changed. Their rivalry is more than just 2 players competing, it's 2 eras colliding. Lisa represented the established order, the queen of the women's game, respected and feared. Fallon represented something new, a fearless challenger who wasn't just satisfied with women's tournaments, but wanted to take on the men, the big stage, and the global spotlight. That shift didn't sit well with everyone, and you could feel the tension every time their paths crossed. On paper, their matches might look like any other darts showdown, but for fans who followed closely, every dart carried an extra layer of meaning. When Fallon won, people said she was eclipsing Lisa. When Lisa fought back, it felt like she was defending her crown. And in a sport where perception often matters as much as results, those battles told a bigger story. Was Lisa Ashton being pushed aside by the new star, or was she reminding Fallon who had ruled the stage long before she arrived? Fallon herself has hinted at feeling isolated in women's darts, saying she isn't always welcomed by her female peers. And while she hasn't singled out Lisa directly, many fans have connected the dots. Ashton is often painted as the player who had the most to lose from Fallon's rise. The titles, the attention, the sponsorships, and the symbolic status as the face of women's darts. That kind of shift doesn't happen without friction, and it's easy to imagine that behind polite handshakes, there's a rivalry that runs much deeper. Think about it, Lisa had decades of dominance, but the media suddenly crowned Fallon the Queen of the Palace after her win at the World Championship. Overnight, Fallon became the headline, the one everyone wanted to interview, while Lisa, who had carried women's darts for years, was left in the background. For a competitor like Lisa Ashton, that must have stung. And for Fallon, constantly being compared to Lisa, the shadow of that rivalry is impossible to escape. Fans online still debate who is the real queen of women's darts, Lisa with her unmatched resume, or Fallon with her groundbreaking impact on the global stage. And that debate keeps the tension alive even when the two aren't speaking. Because in sports, sometimes the biggest rivalries aren't loud or dramatic, they're the silent battles where respect and resentment blur together. So while Fallon might never come out and say she hates Lisa Ashton, the history between them tells its own story. A story of an old guard refusing to step aside and a new star refusing to play by the old rules. And if that sounds complicated, just wait until you see how things played out with the next player, because Fallon's rivalry with Bo Greaves adds an entirely new twist. If Lisa Ashton represents the old guard, then Bo Greaves is the future. At just a teenager, Bo exploded onto the darts scene with raw talent that many fans believe could carry her to the very top. And while Fallon Sherrock has often praised her, calling her a brilliant player, there's no denying that Bo's rise has created a new kind of tension, one built on competition, pride, and the battle for the spotlight. For Fallon, who shattered the glass ceiling by beating men at the World Championship, her legacy has always been tied to breaking barriers. But Bo? She's taken a different path. Dominating the women's circuit, racking up win after win, she's built her reputation almost entirely against female opponents. That difference in approach has caused quiet friction. Fallon has openly said that too many women are afraid to test themselves against men, and that this mindset holds the women's game back. While she never named Bo directly, many fans saw her comments as a thinly veiled shot at the young star. And here's where it gets complicated. Bo's dominance is undeniable. She's crushed nearly everyone put in front of her on the women's tour, often without breaking a sweat. To her supporters, she doesn't need to chase men in order to prove herself, her numbers speak for themselves. But to Fallon, who risked everything stepping onto the men's stage, Bo's decision to stay in her lane feels safe, almost like a refusal to carry the torch that Fallon lit. This subtle divide has fueled endless online debates. Fallon loyalists argue that she's the true pioneer, the one who had the courage to challenge male pros under the brightest lights. Bo's fans counter that she's the better pure talent, the one destined to eclipse Fallon entirely, without needing the men's stage to validate her. And whenever the two meet in a match, those storylines collide, making every dart a proxy battle in their larger rivalry. Behind the polite smiles, you can sense the frost. Fallon has hinted in interviews that she doesn't always feel welcome among female peers anymore, and for many viewers, Bo Greaves is the face of that shift. Younger, hungrier, and backed by fans who see her as the new standard, Bo embodies both respect and rivalry rolled into one. For Fallon, it's not just about losing a match, it's about losing the role of trailblazer, the title of face of women's darts that she fought so hard to claim. And when the darts world constantly compares them, it only deepens the divide. Fallon may admire Bo's skill, but admiration doesn't erase tension. Every victory Bo racks up on the women's stage is another reminder that Fallon's spotlight is no longer guaranteed. So, while you'll never hear Fallon Sherrock publicly declare war on Bo Greaves, the rivalry speaks for itself. 2 stars, 2 different paths, and 1 throne that can't be shared. But as fierce as her rivalries with women are, Fallon has admitted that some of her worst experiences come not from female opponents, but from the men who never wanted her there in the first place. Fallon Sherrock's biggest battles have never just been about hitting doubles or scoring 180 seconds. Some of her toughest fights have been psychological, standing on a stage where half the room is against her. She's admitted openly that she gets hate from fellow professional players, and not just in the form of cold looks. She's described tournaments where the atmosphere turned toxic, where other players would actively cheer against her, as if watching her fail was the highlight of their night. She's never listed names, and maybe she doesn't have to. For Fallon, it's not about one enemy, it's about a culture in the sport. In her words, "It doesn't matter what I do, I'm still going to get hate." That's not the kind of statement you make after one bad match. That's the kind of thing you say after years of small digs, disrespectful comments, and a locker room that feels more like enemy territory than a community. And you can see the pattern. Male opponents often underestimated her on stage, assuming her presence was a novelty act until she threw them off the board. When she beat Ted Everts and Mensur Suljovic at the World Championship, it wasn't just historic, it was humiliating for the men who became footnotes in her story. For some male pros, losing to Fallon Sherrock wasn't just a defeat, it was a headline that stuck to them forever, and resentment like that doesn't fade. Even when she wins, Fallon can feel the hostility. She's described the environment as not nice, a place where instead of celebrating her achievements, some of her peers would rather downplay them. And that's the irony. The more Fallon succeeded, the more some male professionals seem to resent her. For Fallon, those players may never be enemies she names directly, but they don't need to be. Because when you're fighting a room full of silent critics, it doesn't feel like one rival, it feels like the whole sport has its arms crossed against you. And if that wasn't difficult enough, Fallon also has to deal with the rising male stars whose fame sometimes overshadows her own. When Fallon Sherrock became the Queen of the Palace in 2019, she wasn't just a darts player anymore, she was a global story. Headlines, interviews, sponsorships, she carried the title of the sport's great trailblazer. But just a few years later, a teenager came along who changed everything: Luke Littler. Fallon has admitted it's hard to ignore Luke Littler, and that's an understatement. At just 16, he stormed into the spotlight, smashing records and capturing the imagination of fans and media around the world. Suddenly, Fallon wasn't the only headline maker in town. The new face of darts was no longer a groundbreaking woman, it was a teenage boy with a fearless game and a charm that made him an instant favorite. Now, to be clear, Fallon hasn't trashed Luke personally. She respects talent, and Luke has more than proven he belongs. But the frustration is easy to see. Fallon's groundbreaking wins opened doors and forced the darts world to see beyond tradition. And yet, the attention quickly shifted to Littler, with many fans acting as though he was the only fresh story the sport had ever seen. For Fallon, that's a bitter pill to swallow. She took abuse, skepticism, and hostility just to prove she deserved a spot on the stage. Luke, meanwhile, walked in and was celebrated as a prodigy from the very first throw. The contrast is hard to ignore, and Fallon herself has hinted at how difficult it is to constantly be measured against the hype surrounding players like him. This isn't about jealousy, it's about legacy. Fallon knows she'll always be remembered for making history, but she also knows how quickly the spotlight shifts. In a sport where attention can define careers, being overshadowed by a teenager must sting. So while Fallon might not hate Luke Littler in a personal sense, the rivalry between them is symbolic. She represents the struggle to break barriers. He represents the new wave of hype that sometimes makes her achievements feel overlooked. And in the end, it's not Luke himself that Fallon resents, it's the reminder that her fight for recognition is never truly over. And if rivalries with male stars are frustrating, her most personal heartbreak came from someone who once stood by her side before it all fell apart. Not every rivalry Fallon Sherrock has faced has come from across the stage. One of the most painful came from someone much closer, her former partner, Cameron Menzies. For years, they were seen as darts' power couple, practicing together, supporting each other's careers, and even joking in interviews about how Fallon would batter Cameron in practice matches. To fans, it looked like a perfect pairing, but behind the smiles, things weren't as smooth as they seemed. Reports surfaced that their relationship was under pressure long before the public knew. Former pro Vincent van der Voort even claimed that tensions boiled over during a major tournament. The story went that Cameron, instead of preparing properly, fell asleep on a sofa before his match. Fallon, furious, left him behind at the venue, a moment that symbolized deeper cracks in their relationship. Soon after, the two split up after nearly 4 years together. Neither Fallon nor Cameron has ever gone into detail about what really happened, but the darts community could sense the fallout. Suddenly, Fallon wasn't just dealing with rivals and critics in her sport, she was dealing with heartbreak at home. What makes this tension so striking is that Cameron was one of the few people who truly understood the pressure Fallon was under. He knew what it meant to stand on stage with the world watching, he knew how much hate she faced, and he knew how much it took to keep going. Losing that support system, especially in a sport that can already feel so hostile, must have left Fallon feeling more isolated than ever. And while she's never spoken ill of Cameron in public, the silence speaks volumes. Sometimes the rivals we hate the most are the ones who let us down in ways we never expected. For Fallon, Cameron Menzies represents more than just a breakup. It's the reminder that even those closest to you can become another source of pain. But her battles weren't limited to personal relationships. Some of the toughest critics she's faced have been the very women she thought would stand beside her. For all the headlines about Fallon clashing with male players, some of her sharpest words have been aimed at her fellow women. In 2024, she made a comment that set the darts world buzzing. She said too many female players were scared to play against men. In her eyes, if women kept sticking to the women's tour and avoiding the men's stage, the sport would never grow. It was a bold statement, but one that created instant enemies. Many female players felt Fallon was dismissing their achievements, devaluing the women's tour, and putting herself on a pedestal as the only one brave enough to take on the men. To Fallon, it was just honesty. To others, it sounded like an attack. This wasn't the first time Fallon had hinted at being isolated from her female peers. She once admitted, "I am not welcome with the women much anymore." That's a chilling statement, especially in a sport where solidarity should be natural. Instead of standing shoulder to shoulder with her, many women seem to treat her as an outsider. Maybe it was jealousy over her fame, maybe it was resentment over her comments, or maybe it was just the pressure of constant comparisons. Whatever the reason, Fallon found herself caught in a quiet war with players who should have been her allies. The irony is that Fallon's success should have lifted the women's game as a whole. She brought in new fans, sponsorships, and media attention that had never existed before. But instead of unity, her rise exposed fractures between those who wanted to challenge the men and those who were content to stay in their own circuit. And every time Fallon spoke out about it, those fractures only widened. So, when Fallon talks about feeling unwelcome, it's not just about locker room whispers, it's about a deeper divide. She became the face of women's darts, but instead of being celebrated, she often found herself under attack from the very group she thought she was representing. And that brings us to her final and biggest opponent, because in Fallon's eyes, the problem isn't just individual players, it's the system itself. Sometimes, Fallon Sherrock's biggest enemy isn't a single player at all, it's the system she's forced to compete in. The world of professional darts is still dominated by men, and Fallon has never shied away from saying just how unwelcome that environment can feel. She's described it as not a nice environment, a place where no matter how much she proves herself, she's still met with resistance, criticism, and doubt. Think about it. She made history by becoming the first woman ever to win a match at the PDC World Championship. That should have been a moment of pure celebration. But instead, the spotlight quickly turned into scrutiny. People questioned whether she deserved her invitations, whether she'd earned her place, whether she was being given opportunities just for publicity. Instead of lifting her up, the system often felt like it was dragging her down. And it's not just the critics. The very structure of the sport limits her chances. Women get fewer opportunities on the big stage, and every time Fallon takes one of those rare spots, she knows the backlash is coming. If she wins, she shocks the world. If she loses, the critics say she never belonged there in the first place. It's a lose-lose situation that no male player ever has to face. To Fallon, the system itself has become the ultimate opponent, the faceless rival that constantly reminds her she's different. The men's tour, the rules, the opportunities, the expectations, it all stacks the deck against her. And that kind of opposition is harder to beat than any single player, because it's not about one match, it's about an entire culture. When Fallon says she gets hate from her peers, when she talks about feeling unwelcome, it's not just a passing complaint, it's the reality of fighting for respect in a world built to keep her out. And while rivalries with players like Lisa Ashton, Greaves, or even her ex Cameron Menzies make for headlines, the truth is that her greatest battle has always been against the very system she's trying to change. So who are the players Fallon Sherrock hates? Maybe it's rivals like Lisa Ashton and Greaves who push her and challenge her legacy. Maybe it's the male pros who cheer against her, or rising stars like Luke Littler who steal the spotlight she once owned. Maybe it's the heartbreak of Cameron Menzies, or the cold shoulders from her fellow women on tour. But in the end, her toughest opponent isn't one person, it's the sport itself. The critics, the gatekeepers, the constant pressure to prove herself again and again. Fallon Sherrock's story isn't just about winning darts matches, it's about fighting for a place in a world that never wanted her there in the first place. And that leaves one question: will the system ever truly accept her, or will Fallon Sherrock always be the outsider, battling not just her opponents, but the game itself?